Today, we're going to talk a bit about developing Unity games for SteamOS and Linux. So, how many of you are already using Unity? Oh, that's what I like to see. So you probably all know that Unity is, technically it's a 2D and 3D content creation toolkit and runtime, most commonly known as a video game engine, but it's like all other engines these days, it's used pretty much anywhere where 2D or 3D content has an important role. Unity has a pretty big market share. This is something we're very proud of. We have a lot of users. We have a lot of users shipping a lot of games. One of the things I think is really powerful about Unity, though, is the sheer number of gamers that are out there playing Unity-made games. Our jobs are something that we take very seriously, and of course, developing something like Unity that's ported to the number of platforms that it is, which I always lose track of. I think it's around 24-ish or something, is very hard. And we have a pretty big development team. A lot of people at Unity are kind of focused on the platform-agnostic parts of the engine, and Unity's sort of core functionality, and then every platform has a small team of people behind it kind of driving the porting and the functionality that needs to be developed for that platform. So one of the things I'm going to talk about, or the main thing I'm going to talk about, is basically how Unity works in the context of Linux and SteamOS. And you might be wondering, if you have no idea who I am, who is this woman? Why is she talking to me? Well, I am Natasha Bard. I work as a technical director for R&D at Unity. And I've been at Unity for a little over 6 years now. In my time there, I've worked on a lot of different projects and had a lot of different roles. And one of the things that I've worked on over the years is the porting of the Unity runtime, and then more recently the Unity editor to Linux. And so we're just going to kind of talk a bit about that. We're going to talk about, what you need to do or keep in mind whenever you're trying to build your Unity game for Linux and SteamOS. We're going to talk a bit about kind of the common sort of pitfalls or things that people run into, so you can be aware of that. We're going to talk about maybe some more exciting stuff, stuff that's new in Unity that is relevant to people who are building the games for Linux and SteamOS. Both some stuff that we've already shipped and also some exciting things that are upcoming. And then towards the end, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the thoughts that we have as people who are working on Linux as a gaming platform, where we think we've improved a lot over the last few years, and then kind of what we think is still a problem area where we hope to see improved in the future. And we should have time at the end for questions. If for some reason we don't, or there's too many questions and we run out of time, don't worry, I'll be here afterwards, and we'll be here all day tomorrow as well. And I'm pretty easy to recognize, so just find me afterwards. Okay, so let's get started. So building for Linux and SteamOS, you're more or less all, it seems like, familiar with Unity. So, the main thing is, of course, just click the build button. We all know it's not necessarily that straightforward, but for desktop platforms, actually, it is quite straightforward. One thing that's kind of worth noting is that kind of in Unity context, the Linux standalone player and SteamOS are seen as the same target. The Linux standalone player is compatible with the Steam runtime. We are very, very careful to make sure that it's compatible with the Steam runtime. If I recall correctly, we accidentally broke compatibility with the Steam runtime about a year ago, and believe me, we heard about it. So we're very careful. So the Linux standalone and SteamOS are kind of seen as the same platform. Whenever you select Linux as your target platform, you can choose, of course, different options. There's a standard like development build, which you use if you want to enable the profile or things of that nature. You need to pick an architecture. We support 32-bit and 64-bit. We also have what we call a universal target. That's not exactly what it sounds like. We didn't sort of single-handedly define and implement like a multi-platform single architecture binary and then just start like shipping it and not tell anyone. Although I think it would be cool if somebody did that. It basically just copies the game data, which is the same regardless of 32 or 64-bit, and then supplies the version of the Unity player, or both versions of the Unity player, 32 and 64-bit, so the user can launch whichever one is appropriate for their platform. One thing that I've kind of seen a lot of is that people who aren't necessarily that familiar with Linux will often only build a 32-bit version of their game and ship it. That's actually pretty annoying to your users in many cases because most Linux users, especially Linux gamers, are on 64-bit machines. And you can't run 32-bit applications, especially ones like Unity that do depend on some system libraries, on a 64-bit machine without having to install some 32-bit compatibility libraries, which can be annoying. So it's very valuable to make sure that a 64-bit version of the game is available. For Linux, we also have what we call headless mode. This builds the game with a version of the runtime that has all dependencies on X11 completely stripped. It's designed for, it's most commonly used like when people they need to run like a version of their game like on a server for some reason. Many Linux servers are designed and are completely headless. There's no like, there's no window manager, there's no, X11's not running, it's not even installed in many cases. And so that's the version of the game that you need, or the target that you should use, or the option you should select, if you happen to need that, and that's what it's for. Let's see. So we talked a bit about the targets that you can build to. So what is needed to run the game? Basically only a C++ runtime and sufficient OpenGL capabilities. I guess technically it's worth noting that right now the target machine still needs to be running X11 until very, very recently saying that sufficient OpenGL capabilities were needed sort of implied X11. That's becoming a little bit less true with the progress that like Wayland has made. But basically only C++ runtime and sufficient OpenGL capabilities. As I said, we're very careful to stay compatible with the Steam runtime. When we build a player, we minimize dependencies. We try to minimize our system dependencies as much as possible, and we link most things statically, just to minimize any issues that might show up on an end-user machine. We also only ship what we actually need. Like, for example, we ship our own version of Mono, which is used in our scripting engine, but that is a heavily customized version of Mono that we use, and it's only the subset of Mono that we actually need. We don't ship the whole thing. And one sort of thing to be aware of is that, this is what we do, but if you're using plugins, native plugins that require other dependencies, all bets are kind of off. Like Unity isn't going to solve that problem for you, so the system isn't going to require those. Sometimes that can be a little bit unexpected, so it's worth, being aware of what dependencies your plugins have and what's going to actually be needed on the end user machine. Commonly asked is, what systems does Unity support? Currently, we officially support Ubuntu 12.04 and newer. We expect that the target machine is going to support OpenGL Core Profile 3.2 or newer. In Unity 5.3, we switched to a different OpenGL implementation. And if you're using Unity 5.3 or 5.4, there is an option to force the legacy OpenGL renderer, but that's removed in Unity 5.5 and later. And another very, very important thing is that we support machines that have vendor-supported drivers. So those are drivers that are supported by NVIDIA, AMD, or Intel. Intel's drivers are open source, and AMD contributes to the drivers that have the source available as well. But they need to be using these kinds of drivers. Sometimes we get users who are, depending on like open source drivers like Nouveau or something, and we don't really support those. And common other question, what about other Linux distributions? Well, so Linux is a little bit like Android. It suffers a lot from fragmentation in the user space. But usually Unity games just work. Normally they do. As long as, like I said, the system has the compatible C++ runtime version and the right OpenGL capabilities. We do get, we have analytics that tell us people are using other distributions. I can say for certain, before we shipped Unity support for Linux, I had absolutely no clue that there were so many Arch Linux users in the world. If your players are on other distributions, or if you're on another distribution, feel free to report issues. There aren't any guarantees that we'll do anything about them. We have to be kind of realistic about what we can and can't support. We picked Ubuntu for a few different reasons, but we try to respond to issues regardless of what platform they're reported on. Of course, if it happens to be a distribution where setting up an environment to reproduce the problem is very costly, we're less likely to have the time to look into it. But definitely report the issues. There's no reason why you shouldn't. So it's just a little bit about kind of how you build, what we support, things like that. I want to talk a little bit next about kind of the common pitfalls and caveats that we see some users running into. So the first one is, I guess, kind of expected, case sensitivity. So especially this commonly happens whenever users have developed their game primarily on Windows, which NTFS is case insensitive, or even Mac, which HFS Plus is case insensitive by default. It usually shows up whenever the game developer is trying to load resources or assets in a case-blind manner. So that's not really, there's not really much to do about it other than just be very aware of that. Try not to go down that path, or you'll have to fix it later, but this is just kind of a common thing that sort of comes up. I have hopes, actually, that like someday when this new Apple file system ships that is going to be only case sensitive, maybe this problem will kind of go away, but I guess we'll see. Another one, gamepads. So gamepads are kind of tough. Gamepad layouts are just different than they are on Windows. If you're using your input manager, for example, you just need to know that you're going to expect different inputs. It's worth noting that in addition to configuring input with Unity's input manager, if you are using that, we support configuring gamepads through Steam Big Picture, or with the SVL game controller config variable, which is actually what Steam Big Picture uses. So this is a funny one. So locale. Unity has a, let's call it a quirk, where on Linux, Unity respects the locale of its parent shell. On OS X, it doesn't do this. This, I believe, is due to kind of a discrepancy in the version of model that we're using. You could argue that technically the behavior on Linux is the correct one, but the one on OS X is kind of more convenient. And the problem now is that if we changed it in either place, it would really break a lot of games. So we haven't done anything. What this usually ends up with is that, you build your game for Windows, it's fine. You build it for Mac, maybe, it's fine. Then you build it for Linux, and suddenly you have weird problems, usually with parsing flows. So like 1.53 of an interpreter is 1,530. If you think you're having this problem, you can try setting lcall, the environment variable, to C in your shell before you launch the game. If it goes away, this is definitely your problem. One kind of cool thing, or I should say, like this often will happen, like where in North America, where the system you're developing on is probably set to like English, everything is fine. You don't see any issue. But whenever a user in like Germany or France tries to play your game, they see this kind of problem. You're not sure what's going on or how to reproduce it. One kind of cool thing that you can do is that before you ship your game, you can try testing it with different locales just by setting this lcall variable just in the terminal before you launch your game or whatever. You can try setting it to like French locale or German or whatever, and see if you run into any issues. Now, if you're having this problem, the nice thing is that this is something that you need to fix in user code, and it's pretty simple. We have a snippet here. Just if you're parsing a float, usually people just say, float.parse, and that's it. What you actually should do is tell the parse function to use a kind of culture agnostic culture info object. This says ignore whatever the system locale is, and use a culture info object that's like bound to English, which will give you what you expect. So this is a pretty easy fix if you know what the problem is. Another kind of pitfall and caveats, I kind of harp a little bit on this a few times in this talk, is around OpenGL and kind of also in its comparison to Direct3D. There's just, Unity handles most of the differences. That's kind of the point, one of the main points of what we do. But the OpenGL specification is, in some cases, ambiguous. And that tends to be interpreted like in different ways by different driver teams. I remember back whenever we were shipping support for the Unity runtime on Linux, we ran into an issue, for example, where the spec said, in this particular state, you can't write to this buffer. Okay. It didn't technically specify whether or not you could read from that buffer. And some drivers decided you could, and some drivers decided you couldn't and would give you garbage. So we kind of run into things like that. We generally try to find and hide all of that stuff from you, but sometimes, issues still get exposed that you'll see on Linux using OpenGL that you wouldn't see on Windows with Direct3D. Weird problems often show up with shaders, which is kind of unfortunate because there aren't great diagnostic tools for shaders. But this is just kind of an issue that we have that I hope will be kind of fixed with future technology as well. So those are kind of some of the big kind of pitfalls and caveats. We'll talk a little bit about kind of what is new and what's upcoming. So one thing that's kind of already out there is that Unity 5X ships with newer OpenGL support. Is there anybody in here who is only using Unity 4 and has not used Unity 5 for anything yet? Okay, that's good too. So Unity 5 ships with a lot of new OpenGL goodies. We got support finally for OpenGL 4.3, which gives us compute tessellation and things like that. And I think this is all really exciting because we effectively get rendering quality parity with Direct3D 11. And back when we shipped Linux runtime support in Unity 4, support for OpenGL 4 was like a super common request, and we have all that now. Another thing that's upcoming is the switch to SDL2. This is kind of my pet project. For input and window management of the Unity player, we have been using X11 directly. We had this idea trying to figure out like what would the world look like when eventually X11 gets phased out, or more end users are running alternative display managers like Wayland and Mir, and how would we support that? one of the main motivations for trying to use SDL2 as an abstraction layer for input handling and for window management is to sort of prepare us to be able to support X11, Wayland, and Mir without having to have like 3 separate native implementations. That's gone quite well. And it allowed us to remove a lot of like very ugly X11 code out of our code base, which is very nice. Wayland and Mir are still, they're coming along, but they're still quite immature in a lot of ways. So we'll just kind of have to see how that goes. SDL support for them also does not appear to be entirely complete, but it'll be nice to be kind of ahead of the curve. We don't know for sure when this will ship. It's probably going to be something like the 5.6, 5.7-ish time frame. We'll see. For end users, what should it change? Not nearly as much as everyone expects, actually. It should be more or less transparent. I think probably one of the biggest thing to say about it from an end user perspective is that like most of the rest of the gaming world seems to have been using SDL for a while, and we've been kind of the outlier in that we haven't. So, if there's a SDL bug, then users will be able to use the same workaround they can use from other games. But it should be more or less transparent to end users. But I'm very, very personally excited about this project, and I'm happy to talk, about it more if anyone else, if anybody else wants to discuss. And the other thing is Vulcan. We shipped an experimental. We shipped a build with experimental Vulcan support in September. I mentioned before, like OpenGL has some issues. These are issues that I'm hoping will be fixed with Vulcan. Vulcan is much better performing. It has it has a what is it called? Basically has a layer for like verification from the developer standpoint, so you can check whether you're doing something correct or not. Whereas OpenGL kind of relies on a lot of like runtime verification. This is, I think, just overall very, very exciting, and we'll see how it goes. This isn't a project that I've worked on personally, but the other person, like some of the other people that are working on Vulcan, are here. If you have any questions and want to ask about it. And then, let's see, so talk just a little bit about our thoughts on Linux as a gaming platform. So, we shipped support for the Unity player to run on Linux back in Unity 4, which I think was in 2012. If we kind of look at where we've come in the last few years, we have around 2,750 Linux games on Steam. A very large percentage of these are Unity games, which is something that we're also very, very proud of. Obviously, one of the big pushes behind, or the big motivators for this kind of growth has been, Steam and Valve's push behind Linux. And I think, sort of in the spirit of, what we heard today in the keynote about the future of, gaming and the adoption of open platforms, Linux, of course, fits very well, with that goal. Another thing that we're kind of happy about is that SDL2 shipped with better licensing. I say better, just because, Unity can use LGPL libraries on the desktop. We prefer not to. We really, really, really like to link things statically. Also, we haven't used SDL in the past because when we only need to support X11, we try not to bring in like third-party libraries when there's not a really good reason to. But now with kind of Wayland and Mir potentially coming along, it's much more on the radar to figure out how to support that well, and so it's very convenient for us that SDL2 has shipped with the Z-lib license instead of the LGPL license that SDL1 shipped with. So that's nice, it's very convenient, and the SDL community has been very excited and receptive to Unity's adoption of SDL as well, which is really nice to have that support. And then Wayland and Mir coming along. I can't remember how long ago that it was that Wayland at least was announced. That's kind of interesting as well. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. Definitely, I agree with the arguments behind Wayland or for having Wayland and Mir as well. You know, X11 is very old. We have compositing window managers now, which we didn't have back whenever it was designed. There's a lot of stuff that that we don't need, that we don't use. It's definitely time for it to be replaced with something. Obviously, the adoption of something to replace X11 is going to be very, very slow going. There are a ton of applications out there, like Unity, that only support X11. But I think it's it's kind of an interesting evolution, and we'll see how it goes. And from the Unity standpoint, we're going to try to be ready for whatever does happen. So this is all just kind of progress. If we look at problem areas, it's kind of one big thing here. GPU drivers. It's all just standard stuff, GPU drivers, they have bugs. I've mentioned it before, and I'll say it again. There's competing implementations for ambiguous specs with OpenGL, which is quite problematic. On Linux as well, the graphical debugging tools that let us see what is actually happening with the driver are still very, very poor. The first thing a graphics programmer will try to do is, if there's an issue, is see if that problem reproduces in OpenGL on Windows, where the debugging tools are a lot better. And if it doesn't, then that's very unfortunate, because it just got a lot harder to fix. This is something that the creators of these debugging tools will, have to do something about or not. I hope that they do, but definitely it's something that, really needs to be improved, I think, for the sake of developers. I have a lot of hope and belief that Vulcan will do a lot of good things for kind of Linux as a gaming platform as well, and kind of replace a lot of or get rid of a lot of the issues that we've had in the past over the years with OpenGL. And then finally, just a bit of talk about, I'm just going to mention the Linux editor. So how many of you here know that we ship a Linux editor? That's not as many as I hope. We ship a Linux editor. So we started shipping it about a year ago. We shipped the editor for Linux as an experimental build. Older versions of Linux editor were released from a fork of our mainline code base. So, I guess a bit of background. We kind of worked on porting the, first we ported the Unity runtime to Linux. That was like some work, but the runtime is the runtime. We have a lot more tech in the editor, so porting something like the editor to a third desktop platform, is a lot harder and a lot more work. And so we kind of worked on this kind of casually as a fun project, as a side project for a long time. And we eventually got it working, but when we got it working, it was sort of in what was effectively a fork of our main code base that we couldn't really do much of anything with. So we had to, when we started shipping builds to see what people thought, try to see how they would use it, how many people would use it, we had to rely on we had to basically keep pulling the main line as an upstream into this fork, fix everything that was broken, and then make a build and ship it. So, in older versions, we were shipping out of this fork, so the editor releases sort of lagged the main releases by a little bit. For 5.5 and newer, though, the Linux editor code has all been kind of piecemeal integrated into the main code base, which has decreased the lag a lot. We don't ship. The Linux editor is still an experimental build. It's not built, tested, and verified along, as part of the main release process, along with the other editors. So we don't build and ship Linux editor versions for every single release that's made. We don't ship them for patch releases, for example, only the roll-up releases, and with betas, for example, not necessarily every beta, but whenever there's something big or after it's been a couple or something like that. But it is available. If you go to the forums, if you're interested in trying it, there's a section for, I think, kind of experimental or preview functionality or something like that. And there's a forum thread there, only about the Linux editor, and you can see like all the versions that we've shipped. You can download them, give them a try. You don't need a special license or anything like that. Just give it a go. It's not yet planned to ship it with non-experimental status. It's not planned not to. That's just a decision that we haven't made. We have to look at adoption and look at, what people are using it for, how many people are going to use it, and try to make an intelligent decision about whether, it's what the support burden is going to be and whether it's worth it. So we still ship it as an experimental build for now. We'll see what happens in the future. But regardless of this, it's gotten significantly more stable. Especially recent versions, I get a lot of feedback personally that, the later versions of the editor are very, very stable and compared to the earlier versions, and people really enjoy using it now. Even if you're not interested in developing with Linux as your main desktop platform, it still can be very useful here if you want to reduce your iteration times, if you're trying to build and test a Unity game for Linux or SteamOS, and you need to keep rebuilding your player. The Linux editor can be very valuable to have in that context. So definitely give it a try. If you have feedback about it, please let us know. And I think that is basically all I have. So we'll take questions now. If you want to keep in touch with me afterwards, you can follow me on Twitter, or you can go to my website. I write about lots of things, gaming, Linux, various things like that, so you might find stuff that I've written there interesting. Also another way to keep in touch. I guess that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions?
So I didn't know about the headless mode. What kind of usage do you have, or how many people are using that and building with that? And do you have a lot of, do you have any examples of products out there that we could go see that are utilizing that?
I have no idea about usage. I would have to look at our analytics and see. We get bug reports on it, so I know that it's being used. But yeah, like I said, it's generally used for games where there's a need to have some kind of a headless server somewhere that clients are able to connect to. But I don't know about usage, sorry.
All right, any examples? Are they writing frames out and then streaming those frames? Or is it more of using it as a state machine?
I'm not sure. Do we have any examples? Okay, I think it's more using it like a state machine. But like I said, I haven't worked closely with any developers that are actually using it. But from what we've seen, I think it's more the second.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Hi, I have worked on a game that is just shipped using the headless version. One thing I wanted to ask about that was one thing we found was there wasn't me personally, but I know about it. Problems using both headless and development at the same time. Are you aware of that, and are there any plans to address that and make debugging harder?
Yeah, so the issue is that we don't ship a headless version of the development player. I mean, the headless version, it's super, super strict. I mean, it doesn't even accept keyboard input or anything like that. Generally, the best way, the main issues that people run into is they'll want to profile the headless player, and they can't if there's not a development player. We've considered shipping the development version of the headless player. We haven't decided to for sure, but there's a good chance that we will do that, especially now that kind of our installer mechanism allows us to add the targets that we need without bloating everybody's download with targets they're never going to use. So there's a good chance that we'll do that. In the meantime, if you're running into an issue like that and you need to do something like profile, the best thing you can do is just build a normal player. You can run it in batch mode with -- no graphics. It's pretty similar. The only difference is that it will still require X11 to be installed on the machine, even though it won't use it.
Right.
So you can't necessarily profile like on an actual production server, but that's the closest thing you can do right now. But we are aware of the issue.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
Hi, so I should start by saying I'm actually a developer on STL, so first off, thank you.
Thank you.
I've been wondering about that for so many years, but in addition to all the windowing stuff, because I know that display serving is going to be a huge problem in the coming years, you mentioned already that you have support for the game controller config environment variable. For the STL integration in Unity, other than the config, are you using just STL joystick, or are you actually using the game controller API? And if it's the latter, how is that going to fit into? Because I know like the launcher has like the controller configuration menu. So I just want to know how the STL input is being integrated, and if there's anything we can do to make it, less painful.
What do you mean by game controller API? Are you talking about like the Steam game controller API, or?
Well, like there's STL joystick and then the STL game controller. So like you can do game controller open, which does.
Oh yeah, so we use only game controller stuff. We don't use any of the STL joystick stuff.
Okay, so and then is it still like buttons 0 through X in the launcher dialog, or?
Yeah, so I mean, if the game is using Unity's input manager and uses a launcher dialog, like the user will set the key bindings the way that they want, and we read them. It's just that we use STL, we pull STL for events, we get like, button events and joystick events and things like that, and then we pass those to our input manager, and it actually decides what to do based on like what the user mapped this button to and which button event we just got.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Hello.
Hello. I was wondering if you could talk briefly about performance differences on Linux runtime versus Windows.
We hear that there are some. Definitely the performance profile is going to be different. It's one of those things that people kind of often talk about in a very abstract manner. If there is a performance problem with someone's game, without having that game that we can profile and look at what the problem is, maybe there's something we need to fix, maybe there isn't something, we don't know, then there's not really much we can do about it. So if there is a problem, if you're having a problem with your game or you know someone who is, then please, file an issue, let us know about it. We certainly care, but like I said, it's one of those things you kind of hear about in the abstract, but with not like a lot of concrete references to something that actually is wrong.
Thanks.
Welcome. Hello.
Hi there. It's been a while since I looked at the more of the DLLs and stuff that Unity was requiring for the editor, but are you using a custom UI toolkit for actually rendering all the components in the editor, or are you relying on a multi-platform toolkit such as Qt?
So the Unity editor, uses GTK for like window management and for getting input. The single exception in the future is going to be it will use STL for gamepad input in play mode. But rendering like the Unity UI itself, like that is done like in our own UI system. It's the same UI system that renders like the editor on Mac and Windows as well. So we use GTK kind of only for the basic like window management.
Okay, so what I'd be wondering then would be, have you considered looking into using the more or less native components provided by those toolkits to kind of lessen the amount that you have to maintain in-house for the rendering of the editor?
Well, keeping in mind that we actually have to build and ship the editor on multiple platforms, having one implementation is actually better for us in a lot of ways. We have looked in the past at like maybe we should use, trying to figure out how much we should use native components for and which ones we haven't. But if we were shipping only on Linux, then sure, it would make a lot of sense to use as much native stuff as we could. But we prefer to try to keep as much functionality in our code base as cross-platform as it can be.
All right.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi. We're currently using the Unity editor on Linux as a part of our continuous integration process, and that was a little bit tricky to set up. So we were wondering, do you have any plans to like ship a cut-down version of the editor just for continuous integration and build processing and such?
We don't have any concrete plans. It's something that we talked a little bit about, like maybe even for our own use. I think it's an interesting idea. We've talked about maybe having a version of the editor that can sort of only launch in batch mode and is designed specifically for this particular scenario. I don't know necessarily how much that would fix like your particular problem. Like it's not possible, for example, to run the editor on a completely headless server like it is the player, for example, and that's not going to be possible. So whether it would actually help you if we did that, we would have to like talk about what the actual issues were. But you know, what you're suggesting, we have talked about it. It could be something that we could use ourselves. We don't have any concrete plans to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, like I said, if you have anything else, then you just feel free to find me afterwards. And otherwise, I guess, have a good rest of the conference. Thank you.